Hi, everybody. Sorry, we've had an absolute nightmare with tech today. So I just want to talk to you today about how the lived experience of my peers, both in recovery and in co-production, saved my life, really. 2.5 years ago, I very nearly died following a massive drug overdose, following a massive binge on alcohol and cocaine. And 2.5 years ago, I was completely addicted and mentally and physically broken, seemingly beyond repair. Yet here I am today talking to you all, and it's nothing short of a miracle. And this is the very best version of me as well. You know, my life for 50 years has been incredibly traumatic. There's a QR code in our poster which goes into more detail if you want to click on that. But to summarize, I grew up in a civil war, I grew up in abject poverty, and I suffered terrible abuse and neglect. My parents both had complex issues, both had substance abuse issues, and it was a very chaotic upbringing. I discovered alcohol at the age of 12 and drugs and gambling shortly thereafter. And I suppose the legacy of my trauma was that I had this toxic inferiority my whole life, zero self-esteem, and this carried through life. So I was bullied at every school and every job that I've had. And I was really unable to cope with life's even mundane challenges. So when quite serious ones arisen, like my dad died, and then my mum committed suicide, and I was made redundant all within a 7-month period. I had a complete breakdown. I ended up losing my marriage, my job I had at the time, and became homeless, and I eventually ended up in supported housing. I was in and out of services for 5 years, but they didn't help. In fact, contact with services often left me feeling worse. But then I started working with a support worker called Zoe, and I got well after 40 years of chaos, you know, and Zoe's inspired me in everything that I do now. So why did Zoe succeed when countless others had failed? Well, very simply, she was an addict herself. She was in recovery and she was abstinent, but she just still described herself as an addict. And what this meant was that we had an instant, profound connection. People are very different, but once you've been through similar trauma, that gives you a very, very deep connection with people. She treated me like an equal. She had unbelievable empathy and such a deep understanding of my issues because she'd been through them herself. And she had such a passion for recovery, and it was infectious. She was always positive and always saw the good in me, but she could always see through my bullshit and excuses, and she had the credibility to challenge me when this was required, you know. I couldn't say to her that she didn't get it or she didn't understand, because she'd been exactly where I'd been, and she believed in me until I could believe in myself. Critically, though, I think she had the innate credibility with me. So when she suggested doing things like that had worked for her, like attending peer support groups and the K-Bops co-production forum, I listened to her. You know, she was living proof that this stuff worked. So then I started to connect with peers who were just like me. I started to get hope and confidence for the first time ever. I started to get some faith in myself, and faith, I think, for the first time ever in my fellow man. So, and peer support is reciprocal. I keep my recovery by giving it away, and I could talk for hours about this alone. It's just beautiful how this stuff works. Lived experience is not a new phenomenon, though. I mean, philosophers as far back as Plato through to Carl Jung have written about the concept of the wounded healer. And now through my healing, I help others to get well, and they in turn help others, and a little bit of love ripples out into the world. It's my passionate belief that lived experience is an absolutely priceless gift. It cannot be taught, and it cannot be taught. It should be cherished and embedded throughout services from the front line right through to the boardroom. At K-Pop, our co-production and peer mentor programs are inspiring individuals to redefine their trauma, and by doing so, redefine themselves and transform their entire lives. And what was possible for me is possible for anybody. Thanks for listening, and I'll pass you back to Vic to finish.
Harnessing the power of lived experience changes everything. It changes systems, it changes processes, it changes how we work with people. And I think most importantly, it turns people's challenges and trauma into triumph. It challenges and holds services and commissioners to account. It puts the people at the heart of the services in the centre and leading the way in how we work, how we help people achieve the outcomes they want to achieve, continuously highlighting what the services can do to improve. For the people who share their experiences and ideas, the opportunities that this type of collaboration brings is immeasurable. It creates a sense of purposefulness, it brings personal development, confidence and meaning. It makes people feel empowered and that their voice matters. When our members work with managers and delivery teams to develop and design new aspects of the service or revise how things currently work, they feel valued and that their experience means something. It truly has power. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael and Victoria. I can hear clapping in the room. We're going to move straight to Patsy before coming back with a couple of questions.
Okay, that's a tough act to follow. So, good morning. It's 4 a.m. Pacific time for me. So I'm delighted to be here. And so I'm going to talk about looking at community philanthropy, place-based philanthropy in a United States context. Next slide, please. So I'll just talk about what forms of community philanthropy are in the United States. They historically began with the development of the Community Foundation, which is now a global foundation, where it was a response to the scientific approach to institutional philanthropy in the early 19th century, Carnegie, Rockefeller, et cetera, to provide citizen-led action, and that's place-based and only centered in place. It's built on the premises of reciprocity and trust, and I think, you know, Victoria and Michael did a great job about speaking about what that is, you know, with direct service and the grassroots level. So next slide, please. In 2014, the Chicago Community Trust, one of the oldest community foundations in the United States, and a large community foundation, decided that they needed to go into their community to find out what their community needed to be funded. And what their goal was in terms of a social outcome was civic engagement and participation, as opposed to necessarily funding programming. And at the inaugural event, you can see, I have on the slide, there were 11,500 people who attended, 1,100 mealtime conversations on the table. And the model for the on the table was to say, if I were to invite 10 of you to come to my table, and we would generically talk about a topic that we believed was of importance. There was really not initially any type of a guided question that went on. Next slide, please. In 2018, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, they were the two brothers who founded Knight Ridder newspapers, also TV stations, radio stations, a large chain of news outlets in the United States, decided that they were going to take this model into communities where they had newspapers and partner with community foundations. And they provided $2 million worth of funding in 10 inaugural cities across the United States to find out what people in their communities wanted. And they would have data and insights from that. And from the Knight Foundation, there was a model that was developed then to bring people together to ask open-ended questions, to take a deep dive. And next slide, please. So there are 10 community foundations, and what we wanted to do in our research team was to look at the grant making as a result of the priorities established. So community foundations are public charities in the United States. They don't pay taxes, they're tax exempt, but they have to file tax returns annually with the IRS. So we examined the annual filings with the IRS in 2019 and 2020 data to align the funding with the issue areas. And what we did was we were able then to see for tax years 2019 and 2020 from the 2018 events what the funding was. Next slide, please. You can't really see this, it's super tiny. I can't really see it, but I can tell you the top funding areas across the 3 communities were economic development, youth development, and social justice, inclusion topics there, and their variety of other topics. So what we decided to do was to focus on the top 3 areas of funding: economic development, social justice, and youth development from the tax returns. Next slide, please. So with the use of the descriptive statistics that we looked at, classifying the funding according to what's called the National Taxonomy for Exempt Organizations, we began to look to see the funding pockets in economic development, social justice, and youth funding. And that rather than have a whole bunch of slides, I have a little brief table here to talk about this. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about the largest foundation. So Silicon Valley, I think everyone has heard of Technology Land. It's one of the largest community foundations in the United States. They had annual funding. This is just looking at 2019 from the 2018 year of $53 million. So in terms of their priority funding, youth was number one. And that funding amount was just over $35 million, with economic development coming in next at $14 million and social justice below at just under $5 billion. Which is interesting because when we look at this, Silicon Valley is the only one with a larger pocket of funding by dollars in terms of social justice funding. And then the top areas of the 6 foundations were in the areas of economic development. And a lot of these areas, they're really broken in between high wealth areas, Silicon Valley, Palm Beach, and Florida, with the rest of Carolina Community Foundation, that's a large area in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is also a technology hub. The other areas tend to be more rural, where there are local newspapers. And so the breakdown is largely in economic development. Many of these foundations are in the rural South. And Philadelphia, you can see as well, there have been large social justice issues, but the only larger pocket in terms of percentage was the Miami Community Foundation, but dollars wise, it was the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So from next slide, please. So what we learned from this area of funding was that community foundations listen to the priorities that their community funded, and that millions of dollars were dispensed in these 3 areas from these conversations from communities to say that we needed these things funded. I will tell you anecdotally from the data, which I'm not presenting in the slide given the time, is that many of the on the table discussions were directed for areas of funding. So there's not really a random selection or deliberative process to bring people to consensus on these areas. But we believe that when we look at a social outcome, that we can look at the on the table model as a process where community foundations can actually engage with their communities and increase social capital. It might be bonding social capital within your own group, although the model asks to reach out to those who are different to increase social capital. So we believe that it does increase social capital, and that we can see by looking at the areas that anecdotally it increased civic engagement. I'm sorry, I'm slow. I haven't really slept that much with the timing here. But in that first year in 2018, over 100,000 people came together in these 10 cities. So as we look at this as a social outcome, we begin to think about, well, how will this align with reducing inequality, SDG number 10. This is part of a book chapter in a forthcoming book, Social Inequality. And the argument is that community participation, co-production of discussion on important community issues will allow other voices to come to the table to bring forth areas that might not be funded, especially in communities that would be less likely to fund social justice. So even seeing that that was a top 3 across these 10 areas, it's not statistically significant, but I will use the term significant in terms of a commitment to funding in that area. Okay, I think I'm right at 7 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That was an amazing start to this session. And I can see in the chats, there's been lots of thanks. And Michael, particularly, I think people found your opening really inspiring. So really appreciate you for sharing your personal experiences there. There's so many questions we could ask at this point, but we are already running behind. So I just want to ask one question to really start getting in a bit into the how of some of the kind of work that's been raised. Michael, I wanted to ask, in terms of the peer support model, I wondered if you could talk about what aspect of it, why do you think it's been so effective? What aspects of it have made it effective? And then we're going to have to move on to the next section, but hopefully we'll have time for questions after that.
Hi, everybody. Well, it's experts by experience, really, like all the points that I pointed out, that what the credibility and just that profound connection that you have with people. When I'm in recovery meetings, there's people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, but we've all got that shared common bond of that we've all ended up being addicted, and it's the same for any kind of trauma that people suffer. Once you've been through that, and you've come through the other side, then you inspire hope in the person that it is possible to get through it, that it is possible to get well, it's possible to heal and recover, and that's incredibly powerful, and also I think once you come through and you've been through so much, and you get through and you have such gratitude for life, and you have a natural desire. I have, and many people that I work with have just a natural desire to want to give back and want to be of service to others, and that's why it's an incredibly effective way of working.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I'm hearing, I think you talked about credibility. I'm hearing about the power of kind of authenticity. And I think that has really set us up well for thinking about why we do believe that this work is important. We are going to move on to the next section of this discussion. So thank you, panelists, so far. We're now going to think about the application of participatory methods in research. And for this, we're going to hear from Mohammed and Gary. I guess I wanted to suggest that in traditional research, there's more of a clear distinction between the researcher and who is being researched. But here, I think when we talk about participatory methods, what we're pointing to is work with people at each research stage, creating equality between participants and researchers. And the idea being that we're kind of working with people rather than on people. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mohammed to talk about some of the barriers and constraints and experiences that he's been working through at the research-led research hub. So Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you so much. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and I am a research officer at the Refugee-led Research Hub. I am originally from Somalia, but I have been a refugee in Kenya since I was a young child. So originally in Kakuma refugee camp, but today I am here at Nairobi. And I want to speak from the perspective of someone with lived experience who now engages in research. And we can go to the next slide. I will tell you about the hub that we have established. The Refugee-led Research Hub is affiliated with the Refugee Studies Center in Oxford, which is based at the University of Oxford. So for us, what was the barrier to refugee leadership? In Kakuma refugee camp, I was a community leader in the camp for more than 10 years. In my capacity as a community leader, I was in charge of almost 65,000 other refugees who were also in the camp. But I always found that when academics came into the camp, when researchers came, I was only an interpreter. I only helped them to go into the community and collect data. I was never involved or took part in the research itself. And my name was never on any publication. I never got any authorship. And when we tried to demand to be involved, it was only from a tokenistic perspective to share your lived experience without actually contributing anything meaningful. Some of the other barriers that we see in refugee leadership is lack of professional opportunities in the camp, in urban areas as a refugee. Because of the migration status, there is limited involvement in some of this. People want to help you, people want to write about you, people want to advocate for you, but people don't feel comfortable with having you speak for yourself, and that is what we're trying to change. Next slide. Basically, this is what the hub is. It's based here in Nairobi. We have an academic pillar which helps refugees get into graduate schools, universities in other parts of the world. We also have a research pillar, and I'm part of the research pillar. And we try to bring light to some of the issues that are facing refugees here in Kenya, but also in Africa. We have a diverse team, and for us, the core team is refugees. We have non-refugees who are part of the team, but their role is skills transfer and helping us as refugee researchers get the capacity we need so that we can lead the research. Next slide. And basically, this is our theory of change. What we're trying to ultimately get to is transformative leadership. We want people with lived experience of displacement to lead systems of change. We want refugees to be in charge of UNHCR, the refugee agency, all of these other institutions that are related, whether it's the humanitarian space, whether it's research institutions. We want people with lived experience to be at the forefront of this. So that is our theory of change. Next slide. How did we go about establishing refugee leadership? So for us, it was intentional. We hire refugees, other refugees who have lived experience. We have non-refugees on the team, but we have clear decision-making pathways. And it's clear that the non-refugee members of the team are there as a skills transfer. They're here as allies. They have access to spaces that we as African refugees do not. So it's to facilitate that empowerment. Next slide. What do we recommend for other people who want to look at this? For us, we see the value of co-production, but our main focus is there should be a recognition that refugees can lead research, that people with lived experience can take a leadership role in this. And we share with other people, and we recommend that you have exit strategies as a if you don't have the lived experience yourself as a non-refugee, there should be exit strategies, give space to people with lived experience. And to the donors, we ask them to loosen sometimes the research grants because they ask for a lot of documentations or many number of years of experience, which we may not have as a refugee-led research. And also to the publishers and to the journals, we ask them to seek content, be intentional about trying to find research that is authored by refugees. We have content, we have created research papers looking at many dynamics within the refugee camps. What is the meaning of belonging? And in other topics, we focus mostly on self-reliance and refugee leadership. So we ask publishers to try to find content and be more intentional in publishing and giving a platform to refugees who have experience in this. Next slide. I think this is my last slide, and this is some of the things, some of the reports that we published. Our largest research was last year. It was a 4-country research. We looked at the role of refugee-led organizations in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. We realized that in the time of COVID-19, when the airplanes stopped coming to the camps, it was now more visible that people were actually helping themselves. So we capitalized on that, and we sought to get more information on what the refugee response looks like when people themselves are leading this. So we have published other research looking at access to citizenship. We've published research looking at access to work permits and also other areas. So for us, this is the role in that gap that we want to fill, and especially in forced migration and refugee studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I feel like you really picked out some of the different roles that people can play around co-production and participatory methods. We're going to move straight to Gary now to talk about your social innovation models. So Gary, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm a little disappointed I'm not able to be there in person this year, but I am excited to be able to share some of the ideas. And I think I actually want to start by just emphasizing something that the team from KBOT said, if I can go so bold to use the acronym. One of the things I think was really important there is, and that you're hearing in some of the other talks as well, is not just that we need to include people with lived expertise, but they talked about the how. And I think what you'll see that aligns quite well with what I'm going to share is they did it iteratively to get to the point of true power sharing and ownership. And I think that's the point that we're seeing over and over again in work that I've done over the last decade in social innovation. And I want to apologize as well because I'm getting over a bug. So this is work which is joint with colleagues. We were all at USC at one time. Victoria Ciudad Real is now a PhD student at UC Irvine. The managing director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, Sabamuine Chang, and then myself. Next slide, please. And so as we started this session, I do want to start with just quickly with introductions, because I think it is important to understand what these words are in these contexts. And of course, everybody might have a slightly different definition, but my own definition of social innovation emphasizes these iterative inclusive processes, and that they're intended to generate more effective and just solutions to complex social problems. On the next slide, you see sort of a visual illustration of how that happens. And that co-production, while generating the ideas at early stages, also is a real ethos in the process of social innovation as we continue to try new things and iterate. And I think when you have a situation where you have traditionally excluded people in the past from processes of power, I think it's really critical to have iteration. The next slide, please. So the next definition has to do with anti-racist. So we use Kindy's definition from his 2019 book. And he defines anti-racism as the opposite of racist, as it actively recognizes racism, seeks to undo inequities produced by it. The anti-racism, using a race-forward definition, is facilitated with a definition of equity, but it doesn't seek only equitable outcomes, but also equitable processes to produce those outcomes. So once again, the key to power sharing and design is essential. Next slide, please. And so when we were doing our work to address homelessness in LA, it really becomes quite apparent that there's three main drivers of people experiencing homelessness. And the first one is institutional racism. The others have to do with the lack of housing and the cost of the housing that exists. On the next slide. So what was key in our work is to apply iterative power building relationships through co-production. When we bring in broad stakeholder groups, and by centering Black and Brown voices in each of these, from each of these groups, and by iterating through these processes, it wasn't just a structure that was a comfortable structure for those who might be in power in the county government or even a nonprofit. But instead, the iteration allowed these forms to change over time. And so we created collective action networks. And that helped us create new measures of success, working with our race equity committee, developing a new shared language, a shared history, and shared culture. Next slide, please. And ultimately, while it doesn't need to be a social innovation process to address issues of racism inherent as a predictor of homelessness, social innovation is well suited to address a complex problem like homelessness, to recognize racism as one of the causes. And so we conclude by noting that these social innovation processes are well aligned with processes that can address racism. Once again, my apologies for my voice, but thank you for allowing me to be here today to share this work. There is a paper that I can make available, so please reach out to me and I'm happy to send it to you. Thank you.
Gary, thank you so much for that. That was really fascinating. Again, I can see some clapping in the room. I wanted to put a question to both you and Mohammed to start. I think you both touched on different kind of constraints to co-production in different forms. And I wondered if you could both talk about your reflections, lessons on overcoming some of those constraints that you've experienced when doing these methods.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Maybe if I can go first. So for us, we at the Refugee-led Research Hub, we are not experts of co-produced research. You know, for us, we are focused on our refugee leadership, and our approach is more about disruption. And in the cases where outsiders, non-refugees come in, it's about transfer of skills. And I think I just want people to understand, hopefully, that co-produced research is not the only way to involve people with lived experience, especially in the refugee context. Allowing refugees or other people with similar lived experiences to lead research by themselves with support is also an option that we focus on, and we think that may be more sustainable in the long term. So, but for the audience and other people who may be more interested in how to do co-production with refugee researchers, we have developed some guidelines with Carleton University that is in Canada, and we can share those guidelines, and they basically look at positionality and managing power dynamics, but we can share those guidelines also.
I think the biggest problem is that we try to include people with lived expertise within structures that systems who had excluded people with lived expertise operate in. And so that's our sort of default for thinking about how to do something. And so I would argue that it's essential to engage iteratively through a process to uncover in the specific piece of work you're doing how people with lived expertise can contribute and gain power. Is going to look different for someone who's at risk of experiencing homelessness than perhaps for a family whose children are struggling in school. And so if you commit to an iterative process of power building and development, then you're likely to get to the right outcome rather than just simply to create, for instance, a lived experience advisory board or a focus group or something like that, which could work in some situations, but is unlikely to get to true power sharing in all.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I think what I'm hearing there from both of you is what are the structures around which this work happens, and that I think a kind of provocative statement that do we need to pigeonhole lived experience into existing structures? And actually, do we need to make people co-production experts, or actually should people be owning this work themselves? And Gary, I think real focus on like making it specific to the individual project rather than trying to come up with sort of very generic overarching principles that maybe won't speak to the different dynamics in each situation. So lots to think about. Patsy and Victoria, I want to bring you guys back in because we've made it back on time a little bit. There was a really interesting question in the chat about scaling the peer mentor program. And Patsy, I know your work has been kind of taken at scale as well. I'd be really interested in hearing from you both. I guess, again, about the kind of opportunities and constraints of doing this kind of work at a larger scale than maybe we've been thinking about as some of these smaller size projects. So Victoria and Patsy, any thoughts on scale for you both?
Sure, I'll let Victoria, if you want to go first.
No, over to you first.
Okay, all right. I think one of the problems with the on the table model, it's a great step for philanthropy to engage with community, to mitigate criticisms that institutional philanthropy are elitist, and community foundations tend to be less elitist than private foundations. But the model itself is really not an organized structure. It wasn't until 2020 when on the table rolled out into 16 additional cities that had night reader newspapers, that a structure began to be put in place to take a deeper dive. So in 2020, David Schechter, who is a practitioner, he runs the Democracy, well, I should know, I can't think. It's an International Democracy Network. We wrote a research and development note for the New Democracy Foundation out of Australia. I can put the link in the chat, looking at how foundations can use deliberative practices. So again, to Gary's point, focusing on the how. And so if they could use citizen juries or mini publics to bring people in, to take a formal deep dive with an outside consultant on a topic. But this also allows for persons with lived experience to present, in a consultative role as a stakeholder, or maybe randomly selected. But the key to that, and I think, in the first presentation with Victoria and Michael, was so important, is to think about the ethical parameters and not tokenizing people. And in medical research, there's been a lot of work on bringing people in. So what we're looking at to say, this is an excellent model, but how can you go beyond social outcome of citizen engagement and participation in order to scale this model for real community change? And that is bringing in, participants with lived experience to help inform that. So the underlying goal is to really drive deliberative processes to philanthropy. And I'm working on a book looking at that. And that's really outside of the bailiwick of most private foundations, even engaging in the policy sphere. They're not familiar with that area. So that's really what we're hoping to do in a nutshell. And I can pop that research and development note in there. So as to move from informal to more formalized processes.
Thank you. Yeah, and I can see a request in the chat for that note. That's brilliant. Victoria, over to you.
I think sort of peer support models and co-production, it can be replicated and scaled up or down in loads of different ways to respond to community needs, and expand across any program area, really. To do it well, it really needs to be adequately funded, ensure there are resources to support time and coordination, and financial resources as well. And it really should never ever be tokenistic. So what we do at KBOP is we're not satisfied with just who we get walking through the door. We're really actively looking at whose voices we're not hearing from and going out into those communities to find out what's happening for them. So we do a lot of work with sort of asylum seeking and refugee communities, and it's really important that the people that we work with have those experiences. So we're constantly looking at like really broad representation of who we've got on that team. It's not tokenistic. It's not just, to bring in some voices to do a piece of work. We're really thinking about the scale of who we're reaching in those communities. I think the benefits of social outcomes contracts is that we've got the flexibility to adapt and invest all of these innovations so that we can respond whenever we need to. And that it's really meaningful and it's really co-designed and collaborative.
That's super interesting. And I think across those two reflections, there's something about a scale of flexibility to structure and how you get that right as you scale, as you might increase. And also over time, processes that maybe start by feeling quite organic become more formalized, and what are the kind of negotiations around ethics that you need to think about as things are becoming more formalized. So much for us to think about. I'm going to now turn to the audience to see if anybody has any questions. GoLab colleagues, is there anybody in the room that would like to ask a question of our panelists so far?
It's actually just picking up on Victoria's last point about needing the resources and the adequate funding. I'd just like to ask, what sort of time frame does it take to build those relationships and build that kind of trust to have a really good sort of co-production or engagement with those with lived experience? I'm working at a large grant maker that funds frontline service delivery organisations in the UK, and so we're interested in how the the sort of the practicalities of this?
So I think I think you're asking me about how long it takes to get this work off the ground and how long it took to have the financial structures in place. But what I will say is, as an organisation, Bridges and KBOP have fully invested in co-production from the start, and we've done co-production from the very start of the programme. But I think the work that we did really took off when it became completely led by people with lived experience. Everything was facilitated by the forum, by the network. And it was fed into us. It wasn't something that we went in and did with people. It was completely sort of structured around the group, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's when the really incredible work started to happen. So I think that, it really resonated with me what Mohammed was saying about just allowing the experts and the people with that experience to do that work rather than doing it with or for or alongside even.
Amazing. Thank you, Victoria. There's a lot of appreciation in the chat for your answers as well. Gary, I can see you've got your hand up, so we'll come to you.
And just a brief response. I think it's essential to think about what kind of organization you're working with, because as was described by Victoria, they have a commitment to co-production in everything that they do. And it's absolutely essential, in my view, to get people with lived expertise integrated into their work. And so it's probably the wrong thing to do to look at, well, how long might it take for one particular structure or process to be created when you have a set of structures and processes that are coming together. But if you're looking at an organization who has not in the past worked in a co-produced way, it actually can take a number of years. And so they scramble around, and I've seen this in my work in homelessness, just to focus on that you have people who care deeply about bringing in people with lived expertise, never done it before. So again, their first inclination is to use structures that are the structures that are kind of the existing structures. And so it is often the case that those existing structures are not structures people with lived expertise neatly fit into. And so it can be 4 or 5 years before they get close to a point where they actually have authentic power sharing with people with lived expertise making decisions.
Thank you, Gary. And yeah, I feel like you've touched on something I hear quite a lot in the world of government, which is like the problem of seeing this work as one-off, and every time it's a one-off new relationship that needs to be built, things take a lot of time. But there's something about setting these relationships up over time that are sustainable that we could also think about maybe. We're going to take one more question from the room before we move on to our third and final section. GoLab colleagues, over to you if there's anybody in the room. And then if
hi, I'm Ailsa Cook, and I'm from Matrafocus, and we work alongside quite a number of peer support, recovery and co-productive initiatives as learning partner. And I suppose I'm responding a little bit to this word scale, because what we have found a lot through our work alongside these organisations is the biggest challenge is embedding co-production, embedding peer approaches. So it's really building on what everyone else has said. And actually, by seeking to scale, we've observed and kind of have evidence of some really awful unintended consequences. For example, of peer workers being dropped into services where there just really isn't the infrastructure to support them to work in very meaningful ways. And so so for us, the really important question is, how can these initiatives be properly embedded within the systems in which people are working? And I think that picks up really nicely on what Hussein said about, you know, for refugee researchers really to be legitimized, like journals have to be willing to accept that kind of content. It's like, how do we change the systems and processes to allow this work to be embedded, rather than thinking about what's that nice initiative we can pick up and drop in different places in different contexts.
Thank you. That's such a brilliant point around, I think, systems change really, and what elements of the system in terms of power and relationships and resources need to change to enable this work. Do any of our panelists want to pick up on that point? If not, we will move. I just want to check in. I feel like we should move to the third section, but really briefly, just want to check in with the chat. And if anyone wants to either unmute, or if there's any kind of very pressing questions in the online chat before we move on to the third section of our just deep dive. Okay, we will come back to that, but for now, we're going to move on to hearing about participatory approaches in the world of policy and production and policy. We're going to be listening to Sunny and Macarena. Co-production here might refer to the involvement of citizens in designing and shaping services that are offered to them. And co-production, we talk about it a lot in policy making, and sitting in government, I hear it talked about a lot, but definitely as the last kind of reflection raised, there's systems changes that need to be happening in order to enable this kind of work. And hopefully this will let us think about the kinds of skills and tools that policymakers need in order to enable greater participatory approaches to be used. Sunny, we're going to come to you first and then over to Macarena, and then we'll open up for questions.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Hi, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. So Brené Brown suggests that there is power in vulnerability. And if that's the case, then I say lived experience is a superpower. So the lived experience I'm talking about has been mentioned a few times, but I thought it's probably helpful just to frame it, is direct first-hand experience, past or present, of social issues and or injustices. Lived expertise, which again we've heard, is the knowledge, perspectives, insights and understanding gathered through lived experience. And then a lived experience leader is someone who's a change maker, innovator, and a leader who's activated their lived experience to inform, shape and lead their social purpose work, often to directly benefit the communities that they share these experiences with. In September 2007, I activated my lived experience. I knew nothing about commissioning, impact investing, or social outcomes contracting, but I did know that I wanted to use my experiences to positively contribute to the world. Therefore, between that time and 2019, I developed and led a lived experience and community-driven grassroots organization called SUIT, which stands for the Service User Involvement Team. Next slide, please. So when SUIT was initially set up, our prime purpose was to consult with people who were accessing drug treatment interventions across a variety of settings, both within custody and within the community. And what happened, what I realized and became very apparent quickly, was that we were lifting the voices of people and moving them into a strategic environment, and often talking about the changes that needed to take place. But what we learned was that the scale of change was pretty slow, and that, you know, when we were going back to people and that we'd spoken to and consulted with, you know, they were obviously, as you would expect, keen to understand what's going to happen, what's going to change, and it was almost heartbreaking to say to them, well, actually, yeah, they've taken it on board. It'll be looked at. Let's see what happens. So what we decided to do was actually co-produce a way in which we could go from a kind of consultation type approach to one where we could actually intervene and support our peers in different ways. So it's been mentioned a couple of times already today, but I think, you know, how we listen to people really matters. I think, you know, if we listen with a view to understanding rather than a view to respond, then often we can get to the bottom of what's going on. Empathy and compassion have to be at the core and central of what we do, and not to question people's authenticity or experiences is another really important point. One reflection is that as an organization, we were constantly evolving, both in terms of scale, both in terms of activity, but also in terms of how we were attracting people from other sections of society who had heard that, you know, they could have their needs met, who heard that there'd be an advocate or somebody on their side that would be there to champion their cause. That doesn't mean to say that the strategic involvement of people with lived experience isn't important. And I think, you know, over the years, we continue to elevate the voice and experience of others so that we could elevate and social consciousness to continue that influencing role and build awareness. Next slide, please. So the next reflection really is the fact that solutions often exist. And one thing that I, again, learned very early on was that often it was the navigation of systems that people found difficult. It was something that I personally had found difficult for many years because I didn't understand fully what my rights were. And then often there was hostility for lots of different reasons and stigma associated with the life experiences that I had. Ultimately, it's people who will define the success of projects, of contracts, of policies, and of programs. So we spent a lot of time working alongside other professionals to help them to understand how their interventions and support would play a role in a wider ecosystem of support that an individual may need in terms of moving forwards. Now, we really empowered those from disadvantaged backgrounds with a solution focus. And what I often say is that we circumnavigated complex and cumbersome systems alongside people that found it difficult to do so themselves or independently. So going back to that peer support element that was mentioned not too long ago, collaboration, you know, was always at the heart of our approach. And often, as I mentioned, the solutions were there, but the actual coordination element of it was missing. So, you know, one example of that is that we pooled the impact of a huge number of organizations so that the overall impact would take place. And evidence, which I'll come on to speak about in just a second, is another really important part of being able to demonstrate, you know, impact on what we were doing. So we weren't researchers, we weren't you know, people from an academic background, but we were people that wanted to bring about change. And we managed that through a single delivery vehicle, which was the organization that I led. Next slide, please. So I just mentioned the word evidence, and you know, through strategic involvement and looking at the news, looking at papers, speaking to people around us. Often the focus was put forward in a particular way. So some people might be interested in finances, other people were interested in performance management. So, you know, once we decided to co-produce this way of working, it was so important that we were able to evidence the impact of the work that was taking place. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the number of people that we supported. So well over 10,000 people, over 40,000 interventions. But what was really interesting was to look at the type of interventions. So we covered 72 different areas of need. So addiction being one of them, but covering everything from illiteracy to you know, other human rights type of areas. You know, we delivered that through a single vehicle. Social value and to be able to actually demonstrate the cost of this type of work was, again, something that at some meeting I would have been put on the spot to ask the costs of this sort of thing. But it worked out that each intervention that we delivered cost the British taxpayer just over £20, and that was a standard cost regardless of the type of intervention. So stopping, you know, helping somebody not to go back into prison, supporting somebody who was homeless to secure housing, supporting someone else to get work. I mean, this is all, you know, part and parcel of the interventions that we delivered. We saw education, training, and employment as a key driver for social change. So we integrated that within the delivery model and demonstrated social change in practice. Now, just one more reflection is that empowered lived experience, in my belief, can unlock systemic barriers. It can change systems and contribute towards achieving the best outcomes for society. The question really is, are we brave enough to unleash its power? Next and final slide, please. So yeah, so I left the organization in 2019, where I continued my quest in lots of different guises, working as a consultant and a contractor. So, you know, please feel free to reach out to me. I've actually just finished a contract working for the UK Space Agency, which some people might think, well, what's the connection there? I mean, that is to do with the contract work that I do, but the overall mission of the UK Space Agency is around the exploration of space for the betterment of society. So there was my link. And I'm also now in the process of setting up a company with a number of other key kind of amazing change agents, so that we can then support organizations to deliver maximum impact, get the best out of people, and progress social mobility globally across all sectors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just really struck by the quote, how we listen to people really matters. Don't think you could put it more poignantly than that. We are going to come on to Macarena and then open for questions to the room.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today and to share our experience with all of you. I am Macarena Sea, Director of Development and Evaluation at Fundación Luxit in Chile. We are an NGO that is focused in promoting capacities in people through sports, entrepreneurship, and education. Today, I want to talk about some information asymmetries in the Chilean educational system. I'm going to give you some background about the Chilean educational context, the information asymmetries, and then most importantly, the solutions we have implemented. Next one, please. To begin with, I'm going to describe in general terms our educational system. Compulsory education lasts 12 years and it's organized into cycles. Primary education between 6 to 14 years old, and secondary education between 15 to 18 years old. You can see in the slide here, primary and secondary education is offered by 3 types of schools: public, voucher, and private schools. Public and voucher schools cater 93% of the student population in Chile, and private schools cater the additional 7% of the students and are fully funded by tuition fees. Voucher and public are state funded. The main difference between them is management. A voucher school being private management, and local and public schools being managed by the local government. And some voucher schools receive additional private funding. We have a stratified system, and this is one of the reasons why in Chile we are reproducing inequalities in our educational school system. Next one, please. After completing primary education, students can choose to continue their education in the vocational or in the academic track. Both tracks have the same curriculum until grade 10. Grades 11 and 12, however, are quite different. While students in the academic track continue under a comprehensive curriculum that prepare them for higher education, students in the vocational track specialize in work-oriented areas. Next one, please. Additionally, despite the vocational track representing only 35% of student population in secondary education, next one, please, almost 80% of lowest income tier attend this type of education. Next one, please. In contrast to students from the academic track, they have less opportunities of pursuing higher education. Next one, please. This results in low prestige qualifications for the vocational students, not only reproducing inequalities, but also perpetuating poverty conditions of these students. Next one. As a result of the disadvantages presented, Fundación Luxit has decided to focus its efforts on the vocational track. These students are the focus of our attention. Next one, please. So, what do we mean by information asymmetries? The concept is well known in economics, especially to describe disparities among markets. But in education, information asymmetries in general refers to situations where one party possesses more or superior information than another. The consequence of this lack of information leads to disadvantages between well-informed students and those less informed. Next one, please. We have identified two areas of information asymmetries. They are at an individual level, referring to the choice of further education institutions, and secondly, at an organizational level, referring to the information gaps between central and local governments. Next one, please. At an individual level, students and their parents often face a huge amount of information. The Ministry of Education, high schools, universities, and institutes provide extensive information, websites, forums, and platforms addressing the subject. Without the appropriate skills to understand this information and without any guidance, it is much more likely that vulnerable students will make poor decisions about their education and their future. Next one, please. As a response to the lack of attention of the state of delivering social policies, Fundación Luxich has designed and implemented two educational programs aimed at narrowing information gaps and addressing inequities of the execution of public education policies. The two programs consider a user experience approach. Next one, please. The Aspiration for the Future program was presented to the Ministry of Education and received their full support and backing. And this is the program that I want to talk to you about today. Next one, please. The scope of work at Fundación Luxich regarding this topic is access to and selection of higher education institutions at the individual level. Next one, please. The Aspiration for the Future program was established in 2020 with the aim of assisting vocational students in making informed decisions about their educational path. It includes an individual survey for the students to assess the level of knowledge about access to higher education and to diagnose their main needs. And second, also includes a personalized interactive brochure that is generated containing the service results tailored to each person's preferences. The design of this personalized interactive brochure was carried out in a participatory manner, incorporating the perspective of the students to ensure their engagement and interest. Next one, please. The intervention also includes a mentoring program for a group of students to promote topics related to higher education and the application and selection processes. This mentoring program is given presentially by teachers or social workers. Next one, please. Finally, the program includes sending personalized reports to participating schools and seeks to build informative capacities within these education establishments. Next one, please. I conclude with this. The program is designed and implemented considering the user experience approach, with a particular consideration for the implementation stage of social programs. The program aims to bring superior education information closer to the most disadvantaged students, enhancing their opportunities of making better decisions for their future. For the Aspiration for the Future program, we carry out a randomized controlled trial to evaluate its efforts. And I'm pleased to say that there was 13 percentage point increase in the probability of the focus students registering for and taking college entrance exams. We also saw a 10 percentage point increase in students applying for funding. And finally, a 5 percentage point increase in the focus students enrolling for further education. While there is still a journey ahead, our programs with the participatory approach are already showing promising results. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions now, and I'd like to kick us off by thinking specifically, Sunny and Macarena, about that policy context that you've opened up for us. In particular, I think you've both worked kind of with and around policymakers doing this kind of work. I wondered if we could think about we've talked a lot about systems and enabling factors. What skills and understanding or organizational structures do you think policymakers need to make better use of lived experience evidence? So Sunny and Macarena, primarily for you guys, but also anyone else on the panel who might want to come back on that afterwards.
I'm happy to jump in. So I think, as I mentioned in my talk, I think, you know, policymakers themselves have access to information, they have access to analysis that will allow them to formulate policies that will, you know, help to achieve whichever objective it may be. But I think where it, you know, from my experience, where things get let down is the implementation of policy. So, you know, you might have all the evidence, all the best intentions in the world to have a specific policy for a particular area, but as I mentioned in my talk, often it's people's interpretation of policy. So I think lived experience there, you know, can really help to shape the policy implementation. But also likewise, you know, in terms of, you know, pulling policy together, I think there's a role for lived experience, because it really helps to look at things differently. And I think that's definitely what I learned. I mean, for me, it's not just about my lived experience, but it's about the lived experience of, you know, thousands of people that I came into contact with, each of whom would have their own take on things. So I think, you know, there's definitely a space there to ensure that those voices influence policy, but then also likewise have an opportunity to work with the implementation.
Well, I think the government has big talent, big challenges because of the skills that we need. In the social emotional kingdom, we need empathy, listening capacity, and a strong sense of duty, and that it's not quite often to find. And in the technical kingdom, I think the principal skills that we need is methodological, quantitative, and qualitative research skillings to understand information and to gather the information, to design the instruments that are gathering the information. And those are the methodological skills that the governments and the practitioners may develop.
Thank you. That's super interesting. And like, it's that those values of listening and empathy, which sometimes we take for granted, but actually are skills. And then also you pointed to the kind of methodological skills as well. And something I've been grappling with is, can anybody do this work? Can all policymakers or all service delivery people do meaningful lived experience work? Or actually, is this a really specialist skill and something that we need to like really think about how we train people to do this work properly? Enough from me. I'm going to open up to the floor. In the room, does anybody have any questions now? I think we're just going to open this up to across our panelists in the last few minutes of this session. So Go Lab colleagues, I don't know if anyone in the room has a question they'd like to ask.
Hi, thanks. And thanks to the panel. It's been a really incredible session. Thank you. My question is about the iterative processes, particularly Gary, that you picked up on, but this question is for everyone. Can you give a bit of a flavour of what that process actually looks like? I know you've got your great model, but what did that look like on the ground? How did you iterate that? And then what decisions or surprises did you kind of make as a result of that had changed your approach that you didn't expect?
That's a great question. I and others, please feel free to jump in again, given your context. I would say that what some of the unknowns were, for instance, is our work in the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. It was unclear exactly where and that people with lived expertise would be best integrated. and engage most effectively, that will both serve their own kind of perspectives and also the goals of the collaborative. And I would say in the first year, most of the interactions and iteration happened in our race equity committee. And there was a certain comfort there because many of our people with lived expertise were themselves a non-white identity. But as we shared and thought about designing solutions, eventually we've actually had now people with lived expertise who are on our steering committee. And that was not necessarily a goal, but it became clear that that was necessary in order for us to achieve our ends. And so I think for us, just thinking about the iteration is there's no reason not to start where people with lived expertise are going to feel themselves most comfortable, and then to allow people with lived expertise and others to learn from each other in those spaces, and then move into new spaces. And I don't know where people with lived expertise will end up in the work of research on ending homelessness in LA, but I do see that as one of our goals is how they're integrated in the design and evaluation of research as well. But we don't have those structures yet in place.
Thank you, Gary. Sunny, should we come to you?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. For me, there are three key areas. I think one is risk tolerance, and often the level of risk that organizations or individual people that work within organizations are willing to have are constrained by either policy or by organizational norms and culture. So I think that there's something there around kind of understanding what the risk tolerance of an organization is. From my experience, it's always good to try different things out without a fear of failure. I was always, perhaps this goes back to my lived experience, where some might say my lifestyle was quite risky. So, I mean, as a leader, I embedded that methodology and that thinking within the organization. Not to say that we would do things that were dangerous, but we would try things that would potentially push the barriers a little bit more. And my third point, which is not just around an organization that I've kind of led, but is a broader point, which is around compassionate leadership. I think there's a massive role for leadership in terms of all of these discussions that we're having, whether it's around philanthropy, whether it's funding, commissioning, service design, service delivery. And, I'm a real kind of champion and advocate for the value of compassionate leadership.
Thank you. I really agree with that point about leadership. Patsy, I think you had your hand up. Do you want to come in?
I did. Just to tag on to what Sunny said, I think his point about how we listen and compassionate leadership is we need to think in the policy space who also is influencing policymakers. And I think, that's the space where, looking at deliberative practices to bring in institutional change with large organizations, to have a process to be able to meaningfully listen to their communities and persons with lived experience. How do you shift the mindsets of elites? Because in the policy space of government policy, whether it's the US, UK, Chile, wherever, there are elites who are influencing policy. And, in the UK, for example, the Association of Charitable Foundations is looking at the policy space. And one foundation throughout the UK, the Rank Foundation, routinely uses persons with lived experiences, and they have deeply embedded in the community, and they use participatory grant making. But beyond the funding aspect, I think to Sunny's point is how do we listen? So how do we shift the mindsets of the people that policymakers listen to, who have gravitas that we may not ever reach? And so I just wanted, when he was thinking, I was just thinking we're leaving out sort of these independent actors as well.
Thank you. Such an important point. unfortunately, we're almost at time. So what I want to do is just offer a moment to any of the panelists to share any final reflections before we tie this session up. So if anybody has any kind of last thoughts they want to leave our audience with, please do jump in. Okay, I'm going to move forward. Raise your hand if I've missed anyone. But I think at this point, with a minute to go, it's probably just for me to say a huge thank you to our panelists. I feel like we've delved around the world from Chile to the UK, and listened to kind of examples. And for me, the kind of, I think we started with Michael, and you talked about that one-to-one experience of working with someone, and you said about the kind of caseworker that you worked with. She believed in me until I could believe in myself. And for me, that just set the sort of foundation of why this work can be such a catalyst to changing people's lives. And thank you for opening in that way. And then I think we really continued on thinking about the how, and we looked at different ways of implementing and working with participatory approaches. And I heard someone previously talking about something called liberating the model. And I was really struck by how sometimes it felt like we have all these terms and structures that sort of give us a blueprint for doing co-production or co-design or whatever you want to call it. But ultimately, what I think we've heard today is that we have to be led by the individuals and the relationships that form through this work. And that requires trust, because we are talking about sharing power, and we can't predict where that's going to go. It's iterative and it will have a life of its own. And to do this work meaningfully, it's about trusting other people and building really strong relationships around that trust. So thank you so much for such an inspiring conversation, to all our panelists and to everyone that's joined us for this last hour or so. I've been told there's a feedback form in the chat, so please do turn to Slido and share any feedback that you have. I think it's now lunch for probably everybody, except those joining at different time zones. And the next sessions for those coming to the rest of the conference, I think, start in about an hour. So a huge thank you once again to everybody for joining this incredible conversation.